as an artist, I was ready to kind of say like, well, that day might never come, and I'm okay with that. And I'm just really happy to do what I do. And if I have to work, a side job to make it, a reality, that's fine. And I think that the reason that I had that kind of outlook was that maybe it was from being able to know what it was on the other side, being able to work as on the gallery side and understand that perspective.
This is Joseph Ring. I'm a cattle feedlot operator in Northern Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crowe Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we talk with an artist named Alex Dodge. This is one of the weirdest ways that I've ever found a podcast guest. I got an email, and it was a guy from Japan that was writing me that he, too, had recently named his daughter Violet, although it was in Japanese. And so I started looking into this guy because it seemed just kind of unusual. And it turns out he is a world-famous architect. He has been in galleries all over the world, and when you go look up his art, you see very quickly that what he is doing is something really, really different, special, and exciting. And so I asked him, hey, do you think we could do this interview? And he agreed. And I have been preparing for this for several weeks. Every couple of days, I would pull up his art. I would take a look at it. I would go try and find other pieces of art that I could online. And I am so glad I did, because we have a wide-ranging conversation about textures and about what does it mean to be a creator. What is it like as a father, how living in Japan was during COVID. It was really a fascinating interview, and by the time I was done, I think you'll get the same feeling I do, that I just made a friend with a really special person. And so I hope you enjoy this interview. It's something a little bit different than what we've done in quite some time. In fact, we haven't had an artist on since our good friend Heather Haymart, who painted the tree behind me. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really glad Alex came on. Before we get to that interview, if you want to meet people that are interested in the subjects that we talk about on the podcast, things like these interviews, talking about art, getting goals in shape. Just this month, I decided, hey, I've been a little off my running game. I want to get a little better. So in the network, I'm taking on an accountability buddy where somebody raises their hand and says, hey, I'll take on some of these challenges. We'll check in with each other regularly. These are the kinds of things that happen in this digital neighborhood that we call the Articulate Ventures Network. If you'd like to join, just go to network.articulate.ventures and become one of the people that hangs out with the others that love and listen to the podcast, gets exciting and interesting ideas, talks about things. We just got done with the book Siddhartha for book club, and this month we are reading A Christmas Carol, which is a very quick read. It's only about 68 pages, and we're going to hold the book club on December 19th. And if you'd like to join, you don't even have to be a part of the Articulate Ventures Network. Just reach out and let me know you'd like to join, and we'll send you a link. Also, we are in the midst of the December season. All of the legacy interviews are starting to stack up. If you would like me to interview one of your loved ones, to record their family stories, their histories, their values, messages that they want to live on for a long, long time, go to store.articulate.ventures to hire me to sit down for about an hour, hour and a half with one of your loved ones. If you're in the St. Louis area, we can do it here in my studio. And if not, we can always do it over Zoom. These have turned out wonderfully. We've had so many people telling stories that they don't want lost to the ages, and what an important and exciting thing to do for a Christmas gift. So if you're interested, go to store.articulate.ventures and you can book me during the month of December. Right now, we can still get it in before Christmas. All right, without further ado, we're going to head to the interview with Alex Dodge. Alex Dodge, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So you and I have kind of a fun way that we met. I did Jim Rutt's podcast, and you happened to catch that. And then a few months later, you wrote me an email that you also just had a daughter and named her not quite the same name as my daughter. But why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So right now we're my wife and I, who's Japanese, we're living part-time in Japan between outside Tokyo and New York. And we just had our daughter. She was born about 6 weeks ago at the time of this recording. And we struggled with the name for a long time, but then when we saw her, it was very, very clear that we knew who she was, which was, we named her Sumire. Sumire means the flower violet in Japanese. And so when I heard your podcast, I mean, there was a lot that I connected to with your take on being a father, but then, just that kind of coincidence, and really felt like a synchronicity in a way. So I felt like, well, I rarely reach out like that, but it was enough that motivated me to do that.
So whenever I get listener emails, I'm always kind of curious what would prompt somebody to reach out. So I go and look into them. And as I dig into you, I discover very quickly, like, you are a legit artist. You are internationally known. You've done, been in galleries that I've seen in New York. You've been in Kansas. You've been all over in Japan. It is amazing to me. And when I first reached out to you to talk about, hey, would you be interested in doing a podcast? I started with the caveat that because this is an audio, I mean, yes, of course we're on video, but most people listen to this. It's very difficult for me to even have a language to describe art. In fact, I feel pretty intimidated because I this is not something I have a deep background in. And you were like, nah, I think it'll be fine. So if you were going to just take a shot at describing your art to someone that can't see it, how would you go about that?
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is the big problem. I think this is like the core of, I think, why you probably had some hesitation in wanting to talk about art in the first place. And I think it's the difficulty there is it's hard to describe something that's visual. To put that into language is a very difficult thing to begin with. So for me, I mean, I think that I would say that lately, a lot of my work has a lot to do with textiles. It has a lot to do with pattern. It has a lot to do with the tactile nature of both the thing being described, but also very much the tactile nature of the surface of the paint. So it's about, I think that my work is a lot about paint. It's a lot about pattern and a lot about the visual sort of sensation of looking at something like that. So there's a lot of different levels to it. I like to say that on a more abstract level, my work sort of has maybe three sort of simultaneous layers to it. On one hand, the first layer is sort of, I would say, self-portraiture in a sense. It doesn't mean like I'm literally making self-portraits, but oftentimes, especially now in the past 2 years, I've actually started to do figurative or character, based work. And so those are, I think, in many ways, self-portraiture, ways of describing my own experience as a person, as trying to do that. But on another layer, I would say that there are themes that maybe range on science fiction tropes or ideas within science fiction sort of vocabulary. And then I would say the third layer of that is oftentimes an extension of that it can be a form of maybe cultural critique or ways of talking about the present through a kind of lens of an alternate timeline or science fiction sort of vantage point. And so I think that all of those things are maybe that's a way of kind of talking about the way that I just the imagery or something that I'm working with. But on a more technical or kind of process level, it's a lot of the work that I do. Most of the work I do now is really coming from a process that starts with ideas and might start with a sketch, but most of the work I do is really in a virtual space. So I'm actually creating rich 3D simulated worlds, really, and then figuring out how to take that virtual object or experience or situation and turn that back into a painting. And so I've kind of created an elaborate process of doing that uses a lot of different digital and analog tools to turn something from an idea to a virtual situation or object, and then back into a physical acrylic and oil painted object. So
In preparing for this interview, I've spent quite a bit of time with your art.
Well, thank you.
Whether or not you can see that, in its fullness. Now that I'm looking at you and your background, you can see the prints are much larger in your background than they are on my computer. But when I was looking at your stuff, I was very struck by two things. One is I have a very good friend named Rob Long. He's been a guest on the podcast a couple of times, and we would occasionally encounter art at like a coffee shop, and he could really just stop what he was doing and look at the art, even if it was something that I was like, this doesn't look very good. And he would always ask the question, well, this person decided they were going to leave something into the world. They were going to put it there and just let people react to it. So I'm trying to figure out what it is that they put there. And oftentimes I can't really tell unless I spend some time with it. And so I spent some time with the very first piece of art on your homepage, where it's like Roger, right? And he's this character that at first it just looks kind of like almost a Sesame Street character staring off into space.
I would say he's sort of an off-brand Muppet, yeah. So
yeah, something like that. And but then as you spend a little bit more time with it, you realize, like, wait a second, the detail here and the texture with that detail is truly awesome. And that from just looking at this two-dimensional space, you can tell that he's got fur, kind of, right? And it's got this like three-dimensional texture to it. He's wearing an Oshkosh, bib overalls, and you can tell that the texture of that, material is different. Then you start looking at the shadow and where his eyes and his gaze are, and you start to realize, like, this is not just a collage of off-brand Muppets, to your point, but it's actually like there's a feeling or an emotion there. And I my mentor Pete always talks about, what is art? Art is something that makes you feel something, and that very first piece absolutely makes you feel something, even though it's just this kind of goofy looking character.
Yeah, I think, well, so I'm really happy that you tapped into a lot of the different things that are going on in that piece. And so, yeah, on one hand, I think for me, giving the viewer an experience, whether it is purely on a formal material kind of, the thing about I think that, on one hand, that painting could be made completely with no surface at all. It could be, just a very, very lightly flat painted painting on canvas, and it could look the same from a distance. But I think that there's something about the closer you get to one of my paintings that it starts to reveal that rich kind of dense and tactile texture of the actual surface like that. That's something that I think that, for one thing, it's something that makes the in-person experience of the painting very special. That's something that you can't, you can get to some degree with a reproduction detail shot or something of the painting. But so on one level, I think that there's something material and tactile that draws a viewer in, and that's an experience in and of itself. The other aspect of, there's something kind of goofy about this character, but then I think what I was kind of motivated in a way to do was wanting to be able to evoke something that I was feeling at the time, which was like, this is really, a lot of that imagery was coming about right at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty, just a lot of kind of looking at this upheaval that was going on. And you could either do that in a very serious kind of way, but you can also, I think, use something like this kind of, like I was saying, it's sort of this off-branded, sort of generic Muppet kind of character. It's disarming in a way. It's somewhat your first encounter is sort of lighthearted, but then there is something deeply, maybe introspective and kind of brooding about that sort of character that's there, trying to make sense of what's going on. And I think that, offering that kind of disarming sort of entry point into that kind of experience as an image was something I was trying to do. This is all, my work really did change a lot during the experience of, first of all, we came here, we got to Japan, and the idea was first to come to Japan, set up our studio, and then go back to New York in 2 months. And then we just happened to get here right at the beginning of, it was like, I would say maybe 2 weeks before Christmas. It was just December. And it just, and at first when it's like, we're right next to China, and we hear this news coming out of Wuhan, And then we're like, wow, we better get back to New York where it's safe. And then we waited a couple more weeks. It's like, yeah, I don't know, maybe we're going to stick around here. So we had basically got stranded here for, we ended up staying here for 7 months more, than we thought. And so a lot of like the stuff that I think that I was going through really influenced the work, and it really started to change. And the characters and a lot of the stuff was something that really came out of the last 2 years. So. Yeah.
Well, to be in a place like Tokyo during the pandemic, Tokyo is hyper dense. It's like density on top of density. And to be in a time when all of a sudden the very thing that makes that city what it is, all of that, those people colliding with one another, slamming into serendipitous collisions, but so many people, you could be anonymous right out in the middle of a crowd. And yet, you're there during a pandemic when everybody is supposed to be completely separate. So, I want to keep talking about the art, but what was the experience like for that?
As you know, the signals that we were getting, at the very beginning, I really, was tuned into CDC, and they're like, oh, you don't need to wear masks. And so, this whole experience is like being in Japan, where it is such a collectivist society, where, to begin with, people wear masks out of, courtesy, if you have a cold or, if it's, allergy season. People are wearing masks here all the time anyway. So it was, just a phenomenon that was very, very common. But at the beginning of it, we were like, oh, it's not a big deal. This whole thing is going to blow over. And like the CDC says you don't need to wear one. So I was kind of like, going around and not wearing one at first. And then little by little, you realize that like, this doesn't really look a lot. And it's like, and actually I had been, my very first time in Japan was 2003. And this was during SARS. And so I was, I knew like, and I think that that's why, all of, well, China is one thing, but Japan was already kind of primed for this. They knew what SARS was like. And so people kind of knew immediately like, yeah, this doesn't look good. And so that was, I think, having a little bit of a memory of that from, that many years ago, but it was kind of that experience, very quickly made me realize like, yeah, something's not quite right about this. And going in through that whole transition into realizing that, yeah, I don't think we're going anywhere. We're going to be here for a while. And at first, I think, the main thing, yeah, you're right. Like Tokyo is this kind of density, but where we're actually out in the sticks. Like we're very much separated from that sort of energy of like the urban center of Tokyo. And so in a way, like we didn't ever feel like, worried in terms of like the virus or being, like we had no cases, and we still don't have any cases really out where we are. And so in a way, like the main thing was just the social isolation, because we just, no one was hanging out. We weren't able to see friends anymore. But I think, being able to be my wife and I have a really great relationship, and we're able to just sort of be out here and enjoy this, the nature. We'd go on hikes, other than, watching the news, like you wouldn't really know that anything was going on. And so we actually had a very fortunate and pretty amazing experience during that time. But the isolation was the big thing. And in many ways, being a visual artist, then, basically someone who spends a lot of time in a room by themselves doing stuff, my routine didn't change. And actually what it did happen is that it did allow me to kind of dive into the work deeper and go into places that I didn't think I was going to go. And so ultimately it turned out to be a really good experience. Going back to New York for the first time, spring of 2020 was the real shock, getting back to New York and seeing everyone else wearing a mask. That was like, what happened? It was just, that was a really, really big deal to see that. And then of course the demonstrations started, and it was just like, it was a wild reentry back into the United States during that time. So
let's talk about you and your deep dive and going to places that you don't expect, because for somebody that's like me, that's not an artist, or whatever art I do is in concert with other people. I'm always around other people, and that's what's required. But for you, when you wake up in the morning, do you know what you're going to be painting? Are you like, hey, I'm going to experiment with crumpling newspapers today and applying, certain types of adhesive to them to see how they stick together? How does this work?
I mean, sometimes it is like that. Sometimes it really is, let's experiment. Let's try something that we haven't done before. And oftentimes it isn't. A lot of the time it's more like, let's see if we can do a little, like a slightly iterative version of another thing, and like, kind of riff on that and see like if we can take this character and, put it into a slightly different position or lighting situation, and see if there's some kind of nuanced. I think that, like, thinking in systems kind of talk, like I think that there's oftentimes you can break down any artist out there into two general kind of categories, and I think that, and when I say exploitative, it's in a positive sense, but there's like exploration and an exploitation in that sense, and it's oftentimes like you find that thread where you discover this amazing kind of new process or this new element in the work, and you can kind of mine that and go deep. Or, you can do the thing which is, costly, which is exploring new ideas. They don't always work out, and it can cost a lot of time to go both seeing what visually works or what technically doesn't work material wise. And so I kind of find that for me, like, I'm much more of an explorer. I'd like to experiment with different ideas, where a lot of people kind of hit their groove, they find something that works, and they can just meditate and riff on that in, like, endlessly. And my work tends to kind of, I think that you can see threads that run through it visually and thematically across the years, but materially, process wise, it tends to change quite a bit from year to year even. So
it's interesting, the way you were describing that. I thought you were going to say that you're more of an exploiter, right? When you were saying, well, it's much more costly to go out and explore, because to me, exploring is the easy thing that I have to avoid doing too much of, right? I can just keep going. I can just, I'm going to keep reading all these new books. I'm going to keep listening to all these different philosophers. And the hardest part for me is to say, I'm going to pick one and then see if I can take it deep enough to be able to discover something valuable. So when you were describing this, I was imagining that you were going to say, that's why I have to pick one, and every once in a while I have to force myself out. Tell me more about this, like, pull towards the exploration.
I think that, that's an interesting way of putting it, because, like, yeah, I think that in that sense, allowing, to find the focus to actually dive deep into something and concentrate on that one. Yeah, I think that for me, being able to find that balance, or at least being able to explore and then say, okay, let's stop here. This looks like a good thing that we need to actually mine and really understand what the extent of this is. I think that's come with age for me, because, when you're young, or when I was younger as an artist, it just seemed like I would get either bored or just felt like I had gotten it in one or two paintings, and I can move past and go on to the next thing. And I think that's probably something that, maybe with age, you start to slow down, you start to see that there's much more possibility in a single idea. Also, I think that one of the big things that I've sort of learned over the years as well, which is kind of related to that, is that rather than fret over getting one painting perfectly right, I oftentimes say, like, well, just do another one. Just iterate, and in a way that actually turns into an exploitative model, because rather than saying, this painting has to be perfect, I have to get everything right in this, you just say, like, you're never going to get it right perfectly, so just do another one, and you do another version, and then another version. And that's actually really what I think, where that kind of exploitative mode kind of really works, because you just, you're kind of trying to get that hand right every single time, or that, shadow, just perfect, or the color relationships right, and you keep on doing it over and over again. And then you look back and you have 20 paintings that, if you had tried to get it all done in one painting, you wouldn't have had this wonderful sort of path to be able to walk through many different versions of the same thing, which is, that's the fortunate side of that, of allowing yourself to not try to do everything in one in one kind of motion. So yeah, so I think that's sort of one way that I've allowed myself to kind of maybe slow down or iterate in a way like that.
So it would appear to me that you have seen a tremendous amount of success. I mean, the museums that you've been in, the fact that you're able to have 2 different studios, it would seem like, what is that like as an artist? Because I think most people most artists spend most of their lives never being successful for whatever that's
absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly fortunate, I mean, and I will say that, the majority of the time that I have considered myself a professional, dedicated artist, I wasn't able to, I was always working another job. I mean, actually, my kind of arc really, I arrived in New York 2001, right before 9/11. And that was like a crazy introduction to.
You're not like the luckiest guy.
But they're always, yeah, that's kind of another way we could take this story, which is, the intervals of global disasters and what they, like I married my wife in Tokyo was really, it would have happened anyway, but I think it was really after the earthquake and tsunami that really kind of said like, yeah, let's go to the city hall. And then we did a real wedding, a year later, but that was really one of the motivations. But yeah, getting to New York, and then, eventually I ended up working in the gallery. I started working in a gallery as an art handler, one of the guys who, puts the art on the wall and patches and does the painting and everything. That was my first job in New York. Which is a pretty typical thing for a lot of artists, a lot of young artists to do when they first get into the scene in New York. But I actually, that was like basically starting in the mailroom. Then I eventually became the director of the gallery, and I actually built other people's careers. So I've been on the other side. I was a dealer selling work. I was at Art Basel Miami, selling lots and lots of artwork to collectors. And so I saw that side of it. And then all throughout this whole time, even as a director of a gallery, I was still doing my own work in studio. So I was like kind of like living both sides of that lifestyle, which is bizarre, but also, invaluable in a sense to be able to, most artists don't understand the other side of the business and don't respect it. So I think that's been a big deal for me to understand how difficult it is as a dealer to sell work, and to build an artist's career and to manage an artist's career in that way. So I did that. And then after 2008, again, another disaster, these moments that kind of tipped the scale. And, I decided that I didn't want to be a dealer anymore. And I ended up going to grad school at NYU at a program called ITP, which was the Interactive Telecommunications Program, which is nothing to do with telecommunications, actually. It was just named at a time when telecommunications meant technology. And that program was all about interactive technology. So I dove deep into code. I didn't do any art during those 2 years, and I just learned how to write code and learned how to do things with computers, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all of that stuff. And then when I came out of that,
what languages were you learning to code in?
Primarily, I ended up, strangely being a person who's, coming from a visual background. I really gravitated towards Python. I thought Python was, and maybe it was because, Python syntactically is very, very clean and looks, it's very readable. It's very much closer to kind of human readable language in that sense. And so I really loved it, and I still do. And I still do write code now and then. I actually do write a lot of my own tools for making my work, so sometimes there's just a small thing that, can help me make a 3D model or do something like that. And so that does come in handy. I don't write code on a regular basis, but that was a huge, a hugely helpful thing. And I ended up with some friends from grad school, started a company, a consulting, technology consultancy to build interactive visual and all kinds of interactive technology for different clients. And we did that for a number of years, but all during this whole time, I was kind of doing my my artwork on the side. And finally, there was that tipping point where I realized that the art was really the thing that was going to make me the most happy. And so I would say about 10 years ago, that was really where things started to kind of pivot in that direction. And it was also, the main thing was, financially, the success was starting to get to the point where I realized that I could survive off of my art. And that, with museum kind of collections and things like that, are a huge help, and also very validating on a personal level as well. So I eventually left the partnership with the company and just ended up doing studio full time. And it's been a pretty wild ride, but it's been amazing and incredibly fortunate. Yeah, you're right. Most artists don't get here, but it took me 15 years, to get anywhere close to this. So, yeah.
Let's talk about that validation. So if you're putting things out there and nobody cares, nobody notices, that has to have, on some ways, to be incredibly frustrating. But on the other hand, then you can do what you want. Does anything change when you start getting validation? People start buying your art. They start saying, "Hey, I want this to be a part of a larger collection." What does that change to the inner psyche of a person that's been, dredging things up from the inside to create on a piece of paper something that didn't exist before? How does it change the way you think about things?
I think for every artist, it's probably very different. I think that for me, it's something that, of course, being able to go to the Whitney Museum and see your own work on the wall, there's something that is, when that happened to me for the first time, I was like, I never thought that day would come. And I think that, in a way, I think on one hand, I think, as an artist, I was ready to kind of say that day might never come, and I'm okay with that. And I'm just really happy to do what I do. And if I have to work, a side job to make it, a reality, that's fine. And I think that the reason for that I had that kind of outlook was that maybe it was from being able to know what it was on the other side, being able to work as on the gallery side and understand that perspective, and knowing how fragile it can be. Because, even right now, even someone who has success and has an established market and has all these things that are there, the bottom can still drop out, and the interest can wane, and so there's no guarantee ever, in the art market. And so I think that on one hand, it can be a mental hurdle in a way to be able to balance, on one hand, the attention, the great validation that comes with that, but also being able to resist the urge to play to your audience in a way, to be able to make sure that you're still innovating for your own sake, and making sure that you're still pushing boundaries and not worrying whether or not people are going to buy it or not. That's a really tough thing to do, but it's essential, because when you can see, I think oftentimes when people get too comfortable and they just say, well, I know what an Alex Dodge looks like, I'll just make one of those, and then cash the check. You can do that probably for a while, but I think eventually you can see when it's not, there's the magic is gone there. There's something that the life has kind of left if you're not pushing yourself anymore. And I think that's where I'm constantly wanting to do that. I'm constantly wanting to explore new ideas, new tools, new ways of thinking about the work that kind of push the envelope in that way, to make sure that I'm still excited about it. And I think that's ultimately, we could talk a lot about what art is for different people in different contexts, but I think ultimately an artist process is sort of taking both the artist's needs and limitations within any given environment and trying to reconcile those or integrate those two things and come with something that I think that you could say, in many ways, I think that an artist's role in society is really as an integrator. an integrator of culture, and you know, that culture can go on, you know, or that those integrated objects or whatever an artist is making, you know, it doesn't have to be a physical thing. Obviously, it could be a performative thing as well. That continues to evolve and become consumed in a different way, even after an artist is, you know, long since it passed. You know, I think right now there's a show of Andy Warhol up at the Brooklyn Museum, which, you know, I'd like to see when I get back. But a lot of the reasoning about a lot of that work, a lot of it has to, you know, things to do with racial injustice, and a lot of his race riot imagery that's going on there. That stuff has new resonance. And not that he wasn't interested in that. Obviously, he was interested in those ideas when he was making that work back in the 1980s or 70s when he was doing it. But now it's like it has a new spotlight that's on it. So it becomes a new kind of integration of ideas that are particularly, you know, of interest right now. And so I think that, you know, whatever it takes to make something that has that relevance in a way, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, like the timing doesn't always match up with, you know, what is going on an artist on their personal time scale versus, you know, when it might be consumed. So it's like the market and the validation with that doesn't always match up the time that the work is being made. And that's unfortunate, but that's just the reality. That so much comes down to timing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the inner psyche of an artist has to be so much different than somebody that's living for the present moment, because like, you could also just say, well, you know, one day I'll be like Van Gogh and people will really understand and they won't just think I'm totally nuts for cutting off my ear and you know, they'll really embrace me. And you're right. Like Warhol has stood some important test of time so far in our culture. You know, when I look at Warhol's cats, I don't get it. I don't understand it, but I know that there are a lot of people that really, really like those, right? They like
Sure.
what
Yeah.
he's doing. And it's a fascinating thing to think about how, what you're creating in this present moment echoes into the future, like, and whether it will or won't last, and whether or not you as an artist should care about that is a really interesting just concept in and of itself. Most people don't have to deal with their own mortality in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, again, you know, asking yourself why I'm making the work, you know, and on one hand, it's like, you know, I suppose to some degree, there is that idea of legacy, or, you know, actually, I mean, I think a lot of it is the integrity of the work on a very physical level, you know, is a big deal for me, and making sure that the object is going to stand the test of time, that it will have some level of permanence that, I mean, because I think that that's something that is different, you know, I have a lot of friends that are using the same tools that I do, that I use in terms of virtual means as a way of making work. But everything they do is going to primarily live on a screen and have a relatively transitory kind of lifespan, because of just the way that screen media is sort of maintained, is that, you know, who knows what is going to be, you know, possibly, you know, viewable in 5 years, let alone 10, 20 years from now. So I think that there is something really, really crucial and special about the physical object, the physical experience, the in-person experience of an artwork. And, you know, dare I say, you know, there's something sacred about it, not necessarily in a religious sense, but I think that in a sense that, you know, in the same way that you can read the same book over and over again and always get something different from it, I think that that's the same thing that a good, a good piece of art, does, is that you can come back to it, that you can view that same painting many, many times and constantly, re-encounter it and see something different in it.
Well, that goes to your point. We met over Jim Rutt, that you also listen to his podcast. He just did a 5-part series on meaning. And during that session, the guy talked about the word sacred and, what is sacred. Well, it really is making
Oh
you
yeah,
feel
John
a sense of,
Vervaeke. Yeah.
feeling
Yeah.
a sense of being at home, right? Feeling a sense of having some sort of connection with it, and that that the sacred transcends wherever you physically are, whatever is going on with you at the time. It's a feeling of like really being deeply connected. And it's interesting because a physical piece of art, having a place to come back to, that's and until I had started going to museums and going to the same museum multiple times, when I was really young, kind of like we were talking about before about explore versus exploit, I didn't want to go see the same museum. Why would you go back there? I've already gone past those. But now that I live in St. Louis and I can come back to the same museum over and over again, the Monet's water lilies are
It's a great
whole
museum.
different
Yeah.
thing for you, because you can see it under different contexts. You can see it with different people there. And yet there's a sacredness to it that it feels somehow like home to me.
Absolutely. I think that going to the Met, and I think that's such it's such a very personal experience, when, whether you're going to the museum in St. Louis or you're going to the Met in New York, I have my own kind of route, and like the things that I want to see that are in the permanent collection. I want to go see the Vermeers, and then I want to go see, the Sargent or whatever. And it's like that, I know what I think I know what I'm going to see when I see it, but then it's always, there's always going to be a different experience. And yeah, you're right. It has a lot to do with the people you're with. You want to share that with someone else. And so you bring them there, I would, can't wait until I can do that with my daughter, to be able to take her and show her, a Vermeer for the first time. That's going to be really, yeah.
Oh man, let's go in this direction, because I am quite excited about this. I remember, so I was taking Violet to the art museum when in the first winter. So every Friday I had a few hours of time and I would always take her. And I remember when we first went, the only thing she would even catch her gaze was pictures of faces or sculptures with faces, right? Other than that, she didn't even see it, didn't even register.
Yeah.
And then one day I noticed that she could tell the color. She started like giggling when she saw something bright. And so then boom, I went straight to the modern art section, and she was just giggling and laughing as though this was like the first time it had ever dawned on her with color.
Man. Yeah, that's
so
exciting. So how old was she when she started to first get the color in that way?
So she was born in August, and that would have been early January. So, about 6-7 months, I think it was about the time, maybe 8 months is when she first started, because you're going through right now. Nobody tells a new dad before you have the baby, like, hey, it's going to be about 4 months before the baby laughs. You don't know that you're dealing with just a straight up terrorist.
Seriously, no, it's she's been pretty amazing and pretty good sleeper, but yeah, it's a whole, it's among many other realizations. It's a whole transition into figuring out.
So as a parent, and you have siblings that are also artists, I don't know if your parents were, do you believe that it was what you were exposed to as a child that made you an artist, or were you always quintessentially an artist?
Yeah, this is a big that's a big question, nurture nature kind of thing in that way, and obviously a combination, but I have to say that a lot of it was, growing up, my mother's a painter. So, so being, I don't even know, probably, 3 years old, and being in her studio, watching her paint, I mean, that had to have been a huge influence. And my brother is also a painter as well. So we have, a family of artists. And so I think that there was also, there was a lot of influence, but it's my brother's work and mine, like, are nothing like, we are coming at the problem of making paintings from like the opposite ends of how you can go about it. So I think that, in many ways, I think that probably I got, maybe more of my father, who is, coming from medicine, who's a doctor, and maybe I got more of the analytical side and figured out, like, my way into it was through, obviously now it's much more through technology and through systems, and figuring out how to take it apart in layers and put it back together again. Whereas my brother's a lot more of a what I would call, a real painter, a real painter's painter. He's really much more about brush to canvas and just figuring it out in the moment, whereas I'm a lot more, tracked out. I mean, I think that the thing that I've been thinking about a lot, not to veer off of, but the thing I've been thinking about a lot lately are the idea of intermediary languages. And that's something that I've just been sort of starting to try to explore a bit more. But I think in my case, like I've been thinking a lot about, why I tend to find the virtual space is this space that, is in between. And it's, for me, it's like there's a concept or motivation, or even maybe a sketch that I'll do, pencil and paper or something like that. And then, but it's the virtual space that is this intermediary space that then comes back into the physical. And I think that, maybe it's sort of like this DNA to RNA to protein kind of like thing, where there's like this in between sort of process. And I've, thinking a lot about maybe how natural language is that sort of thing that sort of gets us between the user and maybe machine learning and AI and things like that with language models in that way. But I think that there's something about that sketching space, that space that is, for me, very, very exciting to be able to have that virtual space that is kind of, anything is possible there. Not everything is possible physically, but you can kind of figure out anything you want to do in that kind of, in that space, and then figure out how to translate that into a physical work.
Yeah, and I think there's something too. I actually, so my notes before this interview, I wrote them down on paper, and then before we got on here, I was like, oh, I better type these up on computer because that way they're easier for me to access. And there's something that happens in that translation that I don't think it's negative or positive, but it is something like clarifying, right? There's when you go from one medium to the next, the very act of moving it, even if I were to write the exact same words, something changes, or something changes in my perception. And then, of course, almost inevitably, not everything does make that conversion, right? So you get rid of some things, you add some new things. And I never thought about this with art or going from the virtual space. Are you in VR, or you're doing it on a computer screen? Or?
I have done some in VR, and I would actually like to do some more of that. So mostly I would say that a lot of what I'm doing is usually, in a range of different 3D programs. So, I have different ones that I do just fabric in, some that I do some of the animation and rigging in, and then, other things like that. But the VR, I have done some VR sculpting, and that's been an incredible experience. I'd like to kind of get back to be able to do more of that. Yeah.
But I also think you're in an unusual space in that you are an artist in Japan, right? So you are like, I watched a video where all of the subtitles, everything in front of you, around you, was in Japanese, right? And then you're speaking in English, but this same thing must occur here, right? Where you're going from your English, Western mind into this. There's some sort of conversion factor that occurs across cultures, I'm sure.
Oh man, yeah, that's, I mean, Japanese, the language, the cultural kind of transitional spaces that I'm, obviously kind of inundated with on a daily basis here is another, that's definitely another intermediary kind of transitional experience as well. And it's, especially with the way that the work is interpreted here and is understood here, it's different. Like the people respond to things differently here, that, just the audience, the cultural sort of lens that things are seen through. I mean, that's, a really exciting thing about making work in Japan is that people see things that, just nobody sees in the US or in Europe or in a more Western context. And
can you give an example?
Yeah, I would say that, and I think that this might have to do with the tradition of, say, printmaking and visual culture in Japan, and the way that art is sort of understood, which is very, very different from the Western progression, is that I think that there's much more of a draw to the surface and to the process of how. So in particular, like the newspaper paintings that I have been making were really, I mean, people just were really fascinated and really drawn to that work. And I think a lot of it was because there, you know, if you see those works in person, there's a lot of this very, very subtle indentation into the oil paint of the New York Times typography and imagery that is all pressed. It's using a process that is very similar to woodblock printing. And so there's a big, tradition of ukiyo-e, which is, Hokusai and Hiroshige. These are guys, that were, the tradition of ukiyo-e, which the woodblock print, this was a very consumable medium. That's the difference is that, the Western model of, the singular object that is worth a lot of money, and the price tag on that is priced as the scarcity of a singular item. Whereas like the tradition of ukiyo-e is like these things were printed. There's no additions. These things were just, hundreds or thousands of images of Mount Fuji, or something like that. And you could, anyone, these were affordable. These were sort of like the comics of the day, being able to go and get one of these things. So it was a mass consumable visual culture. And there are things that are, that were traditionally very, very expensive, and but they don't align very well to a Western idea of art. So it's interesting seeing that foundation culturally and where it leads to people seeing my work and seeing other work. But it's a strange thing right now, because the Western model, the Western gallery model, the Western idea of contemporary art is, I think, now coming into a second sort of wave of collectorship and interest in Japan, where I think that during the 1980s and early 90s, there was an interest in buying Western work, but I feel like it was had more to do with status and more to do with when Japan was in its ascendant sort of rise, it was, buying Rockefeller Center was more of a trophy than it was about really the architecture, and it was, buying a Van Gogh painting was more, I mean, I'm sure that they liked the Van Gogh, but I think it was also a trophy of the West for a time when Japan was seeming to be on this astronomical sort of trajectory like that. And now I think that it's much more earnest. It's much more about really being interested in the work. And the collectors, I was really surprised when I started to show my work over here. I really wasn't sure what to expect. I knew that there was, first of all, there's not as much surplus income in Japan, there's, versus, if you just look at the number of millionaires in the United States or billionaires, for that matter, there's just not that many in Japan, because people aren't compensated the same way, in Japan versus the United States. So the market size is not as big, but I was really, just floored after meeting the collectors who have been responding to my work and collecting it here, that they're just so interested in the work on a very personal level. They are really so passionate about the work, and it's just incredible to meet people that are into it, because people collect work for a lot of different reasons, and as many reasons as people make it, probably, but it was really just heartwarming to be able to meet people and to see how touched and moved they were by it. And, it's been an incredible experience. So yeah, that divide, being able to come here, make work, and really connect with people has been an incredible thing.
Well, it appears to me that Japan has changed you in that you can look at your art, and I can't put my finger on why it looks Japanese. But even if I hadn't been told, there's something to do with the coloration. There's something to do with the way that it's structured. And it's not like, oh, well, he has clearly Asian figures, people in this. That's why. It's not that at all, right? These are, a pile of laundry in some way. Like,
yeah, no, that's right. And I think that there's something about the visual culture here that, I was drawn to many, many years ago, and it just, it keeps kind of infiltrating, your subconscious and the way that you're thinking about making an image. Of course, printmaking in general has been a huge influence, both from the Western tradition and, of course, from the Japanese side. But, that's something without a doubt that is that I've found a huge amount of inspiration from in Japan.
And as you imagine teaching your daughter about art, do you think you will teach her more in a Western tradition or more in a Japanese tradition? How do you think that will go?
Oh, I think it indiscriminately, like all across the board. I think that, that's I don't think that I think that nowadays, first of all, I don't know where she's going to be going to school either, though. That's the big thing. So, will she be more American or will she be more Japanese? I don't know yet. This is a big question. Right now we're, thinking about finding land here to build a bigger studio and set up a bigger thing here. So that, but it's hard to say, but these are big questions, right? We have like a couple of years before we really have to know what that is. But yeah, I think that I'd like her to kind of figure out where that road goes on her own as well. But
Well, Alex, I know you are in the throes of doing early baby things. So if people wanted to learn more about your art, if they wanted to see it, where would you direct them?
You could definitely go to my two main galleries, Klaus von Nixhagen, klausgallery.com. That's Klaus von Nixhagen in New York, and then Maki Fine Arts in Tokyo. And you can always find me on Instagram, Alex Dodge Studio, and I do have a website that I try to maintain pretty well, alexdodge.com. So yeah, any of those places, you can generally find what I'm up to. But
well, I am so grateful that you came on, and I will, without question, have you back on if you'll come on. I feel like
I would love to. Yeah,
I feel like there's so much more to explore. We didn't even really get into all of your. You have your background is so diverse. I would recommend, and I'll leave links in the show descriptions for people to be able to really take an exploration. But I would love to keep this going, to hear how raising your daughter is going. This has been a wonderful way to
that would be amazing. Yeah, this has been incredible. Thank you so much, Vance, for having me on.
Thanks so much for checking out this podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to Alex and I talk about art and being a parent and all of the things that go along with talking about this thing that's normally a visual medium. We really enjoyed it. Alex and I are going to meet up again. I'm really looking forward to hearing how his experience of raising his daughter around art impacts him and what we can learn from it. So be sure that we will invite Alex back on. If you are interested in doing one of those legacy interviews that we talked about at the beginning of the interview, go to store.articulate.ventures, where you can book me to interview one of your loved ones to record their family histories, their values, those stories that you love hearing them tell, and that way they can live on for generations and generations. I hope you will, and we'll be back next week with another interview.